Story number 1.
It was Valentine's Day, and I was excited. I had planned everything perfectly. A romantic dinner with my girlfriend, a stroll through the park, and a gift I had spent weeks picking out. Her favorite flowers, chocolates, a handwritten note. It was supposed to be a perfect evening. The weather was crisp but clear, and we were in the kind of mood that only comes when everything aligns just right. Or so I thought. We had been dating for about a year, and things were going well. I had recently moved into a small apartment in an older building in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, but it was cozy, and the location was perfect. My girlfriend, Jess, loved it. We spent a lot of time together there, cooking dinner, watching movies, and just enjoying each other's company. On Valentine's night, I made sure everything was set up in the apartment. I lit candles, put on some soft music, and opened a bottle of red wine. Jess had mentioned before how she loved old, cozy spaces, and the apartment definitely had that vibe. It was a building that had been around for a century, with wooden floors that creaked, thick walls that seemed to hold on to the past, and a kind of energy that made the place feel lived in. As I set the table, I couldn't help but admire the building's charm. When Jess arrived, her face lit up. She was wearing a red dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders, and she looked absolutely stunning. We exchanged a quick kiss, and I showed her to the table I had set up. We spent the evening enjoying dinner and wine, and as the night wore on, we found ourselves on the couch, cuddling and talking about our future. But then things started to change. It started with the lights flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. The building was old, after all, and power surges were not uncommon. But after the third time it happened, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Jess noticed it too. She looked at me, a slight frown on her face. "Is the electricity acting weird tonight?" she asked, her voice almost hesitant. "Probably just the wiring," I said, brushing it off. "This place is old. Sometimes the lights flicker." But I wasn't entirely sure. The flickering wasn't like anything I had experienced before. It was as if the lights were responding to something or someone. Every time they flickered, it felt like the room grew colder, the air thicker. It was when the sound started that I began to feel uneasy. At first, it was soft, just a faint tapping. It came from somewhere deep within the walls, like nails scratching against wood. I could hear it even over the music. Jess looked at me again, her expression confused. "Do you hear that?" she asked, sitting up straighter. I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. "Probably just the old pipes," I said, but even I didn't believe that. The tapping didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like someone or something was knocking from within the walls. I got up and walked over to the light switch to turn it off, hoping to get a better sense of what was happening. As soon as I flipped the switch, the room plunged into darkness, and the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Jess grabbed my hand, her fingers cold as ice. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt it too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with the apartment, something I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, but they didn't just flicker, they stayed dim, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath in the air. Jess looked at me, wide-eyed, her grip tightening on my hand. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice cracking. "What's going on?" I didn't know how to answer. I had no explanation for what was happening. The room felt heavier, almost as if something invisible was pressing down on us. The old apartment, which had once felt warm and inviting, now seemed dark and oppressive. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the sense that we weren't alone anymore. Then the tapping returned, louder this time and unmistakably coming from inside the walls. It was a rhythmic sound, like someone was knocking in Morse code, deliberate and insistent. The tapping was so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Jess screamed and covered her ears, but I was frozen, unable to move, too scared to react. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet. But then a new sound filled the silence, a voice. Soft at first, but growing clearer. "Leave this place." The voice was raspy, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of desperation. It wasn't coming from Jess, and it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from somewhere deep within the walls, somewhere behind the thick plaster and old wood. The words sent chills down my spine. Jess was trembling now, her face pale. "What was that?" she gasped. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew we weren't alone in this apartment. There was something here with us. "I think we need to leave," I said, my voice shaky, "right now." But as I stood up, ready to grab our things, the room seemed to shift. The door to the hallway slammed shut, rattling the windows. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see frost creeping along the edges of the walls. "Get out," the voice whispered again, louder this time, almost a growl. Jess was crying now, clutching at my arm, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut from the other side. My heart raced as I tried again and again, but it was no use. And then, as I turned back toward the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light, a shadow moved across the far wall. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the shadow grew larger, darker, as if it was taking shape. It was a figure, tall, thin, and completely black. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its presence, its weight. It was watching us, waiting. Jess screamed, and I pulled her toward the window. With one desperate heave, I managed to break it open, and we scrambled out onto the fire escape, too terrified to think about anything else. We didn't stop running until we were out on the street, the cold air hitting our faces as we gasped for breath. I looked back at the apartment building, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were dark, and the door remained closed. There was no sign of movement, but I knew something had been there, something we had disturbed. We never went back to the apartment, and I eventually moved out. I found a new place, far away from that building, but every Valentine's Day since then, I remember the cold, the shadows, and the voice that told us to leave. There are things in this world we can't explain, and sometimes they don't want to be found. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
I had never been one to put much stock in the supernatural. Growing up, I'd heard countless ghost stories from my grandparents, my parents, and even my friends, but I always shrugged them off as mere tales spun to entertain or frighten. I didn't believe in ghosts. But that changed on Valentine's Day, the year I was 26. I had been dating Eric for about a year. He was sweet, caring, and everything I thought I needed. Valentine's Day was always a big deal for him, and this year he had a surprise planned. We'd been talking about it for weeks, though he remained tight-lipped about the details. All he would say was that it would be a night I'd never forget. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued, but I was also a little skeptical. Eric had a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, but I loved him, so I went along with it. That evening, he picked me up from my apartment, wearing his usual grin. He'd made reservations for a fancy dinner at a local restaurant, followed by a walk through the park. It seemed like a sweet plan, but nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't think much of it. When we arrived at the restaurant, I was surprised to find it almost empty. The usual bustling atmosphere was replaced by a quiet hum, the candles flickering gently on every table. Eric's eyes twinkled with excitement as we took our seats. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The waiter was strangely quiet, and when I tried to make small talk with him, he would give me the barest responses before walking away. It was like he was avoiding eye contact. "I have a feeling there's something else to the night," Eric said as he sipped his wine. I smiled, thinking that was his way of keeping the mystery alive. But as I glanced around, I noticed something that made my skin prickle. At the far end of the restaurant, there was a large portrait on the wall. It was an old painting depicting a woman in an elegant gown. She was holding a bouquet of roses and had a haunting, sad expression on her face. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. The image felt oddly familiar, though I was sure I'd never seen it before. The longer I stared, the more I felt like the eyes in the painting were following me. "Are you all right?" Eric asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah, just that painting. It's strange." Eric glanced over and waved it off. "Don't worry about it. Let's enjoy our night." But I couldn't help feeling unsettled. I turned my attention back to him, trying to push the feeling away. After dinner, Eric suggested a walk through the park. The night air was crisp, and I welcomed the change of pace. As we strolled along the path, I started to relax. The warmth of his hand in mine was comforting, and the darkness of the park made everything seem more intimate. We walked in silence for a few minutes before Eric stopped suddenly. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "Feel what?" He took a deep breath, looking over at the trees that swayed in the wind. "There's something here. Something strange." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a cold night, Eric. We're fine." But he didn't laugh with me. Instead, he pulled me towards a secluded area near an old, abandoned house at the edge of the park. The house had been there for as long as I could remember, but I'd never given it much thought. It had been empty for years, the windows boarded up and the once beautiful garden overgrown with weeds. "Why are we here?" I asked, my heart rate picking up as I looked around at the eerie surroundings. "This is the place," Eric said, his voice distant and almost reverent. "This is where it all started." "Started?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, a voice echoed through the night. It was a woman's voice, soft and almost melodic, but it wasn't coming from Eric. It was coming from the house. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. Eric didn't respond. He was staring at the house, his face pale. "Eric?" I asked again, more urgently. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he began to walk towards the house, as if in a trance. I hesitated for a moment before following him. My feet felt heavy as I walked behind him, the sound of the woman's voice growing louder with each step. It was calling out to us, though I couldn't understand what it was saying. When we reached the house, Eric stopped at the front door, which was slightly ajar. The woman's voice was clearer now, almost as if it were speaking directly to us. "Come inside." I hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. "Eric, this is a bad idea. We should go back." But Eric seemed oblivious. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. I could feel the coldness of the air from the doorway, a chill that cut through me. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside after him. The house was dark and musty, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The voice was clearer now, and it sounded like it was coming from upstairs. I tried to call out to Eric, but my voice caught in my throat. I was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and confusion. "Eric," I finally managed to say. "What are we doing here?" He turned to me, his eyes wide and glazed as if he were no longer fully present. "You don't understand. This is where I met her." The words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the voice called again, more urgently this time. "Come upstairs." I felt something tugging at me, drawing me toward the stairs. I didn't want to go, but I found myself climbing the steps against my will. At the top of the stairs, I saw the door to a bedroom slightly cracked open. The voice was louder now, calling out my name. My heart raced as I approached the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the faint glow of a candle, and there, standing by the window, was the woman from the painting. The same woman with the bouquet of roses, her face hauntingly familiar. She was staring out the window, her back to us. I froze in place, fear gripping me. Eric stepped forward, his eyes locked on her, a strange, almost hypnotized expression on his face. "She's the one," he whispered. "She's been waiting for me." The woman slowly turned, her eyes locking with mine. Her gaze was cold, empty, and yet I felt a sharp pang of sorrow in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, I heard the voice again, this time clearer than ever. "Help me." The room began to spin, and I could feel myself slipping, falling, as if the ground beneath me was shifting. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the woman's face, her sad, pleading expression burning into my mind. When I woke up, I was back at my apartment, alone. The sun was rising, casting a soft light through my curtains. My head ached, and I couldn't remember how I had gotten home. My phone buzzed beside me. It was a text from Eric. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. She never meant to hurt anyone." I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. For days, I couldn't get in touch with him. I tried to visit the house, but it had been boarded up. No one lived there anymore. And as I searched for answers, I realized something that made my blood run cold. That woman, the one from the painting, had been missing for over 30 years. The house had once belonged to her family. But that didn't explain why she had chosen that night, why she had called out to me. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that place, where I felt something far older than I could understand was waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, and I had just finished a long day at work. My boyfriend, Alex, and I had planned a quiet evening together at my apartment. No grand gestures, just a simple dinner and some time to relax after a hectic week. He had been distant lately, and I was hoping this night would help bring us closer again. I wasn't expecting anything extravagant, but a part of me hoped for some reassurance that things were still okay between us. I arrived home to find a small bouquet of roses on my doorstep. It wasn't much, but it made me smile. I let myself inside, slipping off my coat and boots, and placed the flowers on the kitchen table. The apartment was dimly lit with a few candles scattered around, the soft glow flickering off the walls. The atmosphere felt unusually calm, and it was exactly the kind of setting I had hoped for. But something felt off. A heavy silence hung in the air, and I couldn't quite place why I felt so uneasy. I shrugged it off and moved to the kitchen to start preparing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for the salad, I heard the front door creak open. My heart skipped a beat, thinking Alex had arrived early. "Hey, you're here," I called out, wiping my hands on a towel as I turned toward the door. But no one answered. I walked over to check, but the hallway was empty. I frowned, my nerves tingling. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks, I thought. But the door had definitely opened, and I had clearly heard footsteps. I double-checked the locks, ensuring everything was secure. There was no sign of anyone else, so I went back to the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Alex finally arrived about an hour later, and the strange unease that had settled over me only deepened. He seemed distracted, his eyes not meeting mine as he gave me a quick hug and handed me a small box wrapped in red paper. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said quietly. "Thank you," I replied, taking the box from him with a forced smile. I could feel that there was something he wasn't telling me, but I didn't want to ruin the night by pressing him. "Let's eat." We sat down at the table, and I tried to push the nagging feeling to the back of my mind. We ate dinner in silence, the conversation strained and distant. It was as if we were both waiting for something to happen, but neither of us knew what that something was. After a while, I excused myself to the bathroom. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I froze in the hallway. The temperature had dropped, and there was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. I glanced at the kitchen, and there, on the counter, was the bouquet of roses I had left earlier. But they weren't the same. The roses were no longer fresh. The petals were wilting and dark, as if they had been sitting there for days, not hours. I reached out to touch them, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from the living room. I rushed into the room, but it was empty. The TV was off, and everything was still. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around the room, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences. I was about to call out for Alex when I noticed something on the coffee table. A small piece of paper, folded neatly. My hands trembled as I picked it up, unfolding it carefully. In delicate handwriting, the note read, "You can't escape him." My blood ran cold. I turned to look at Alex, who was standing at the entrance of the living room. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Who wrote this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes wide. "I didn't write that," he said slowly, "but I think we need to leave." "Leave?" I repeated, feeling more confused by the second. "Why? What's going on, Alex? What's happening?" He hesitated before speaking again. "I'm not sure how to explain this, but I think we're not alone here." The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees, and I could feel my breath turning to mist. The silence in the apartment was deafening, the air thick with an invisible presence. It felt like we were being watched, like something was standing just behind us, waiting. "We need to go," Alex said again, his voice urgent. I nodded slowly, but before we could move, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. We both jumped, and I could feel a cold dread settling over me. I ran to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear Alex breathing heavily behind me as he tried the handle too, but it was no use. The door was locked. I turned to face him, panic rising in my chest. "What is happening? Why won't the door open? What's going on?" Alex seemed lost in thought, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and guilt. It's It's not just the door. Something's here. Something's been following me. What do you mean, something's following you? I asked, my voice shaking. He took a deep breath and looked me in the eyes, finally speaking with a weight of truth in his voice. When I was younger, I did something terrible, and I think it's come back. It's come after me. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I listened. What did you do? I don't know. I've tried to forget about it, tried to move on, but it's been haunting me for years, and now it's here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's been waiting. The door rattled violently, as though something was trying to get in from the other side. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the walls themselves were swallowing it. I felt a pressure in my chest, as though the air itself was thickening, pushing in on me. Then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, standing just outside the reach of the dim candlelight. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. It was staring at us, its eyes glowing a faint red, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and suffocating. "Alex!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. "What is that?" He didn't respond. His face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with fear. He stepped backward, his body trembling as he took in the figure. "It's him," he whispered, as though saying the words aloud might make it worse. I turned to look at the figure again, but it was closer now, its outline clearer. The air grew colder, and I could feel the darkness pressing in, filling the room with a suffocating presence. The figure took a step forward, its form becoming more solid. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't Alex's voice, and it wasn't mine. It was cold, deep, and distant, like it came from far away. "You're not leaving," the voice said, its tone mocking and menacing. I felt my legs weaken, and I collapsed to the floor in terror. Alex reached out to me, but before he could touch me, the figure lunged forward. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Alex's terrified face, his hand reaching out to mine, and then the darkness consuming us both. When I woke up, I was alone. The apartment was quiet again, the air still and cold. The door was unlocked, standing wide open. I stood up, my body aching, and stumbled toward the door. There was no sign of Alex, no trace of the figure. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know where Alex is or what he did to bring whatever it was into our lives. But I do know this. Something followed me home that night, and it hasn't left. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I remember that Valentine's Day like it was yesterday, even though it was years ago now. My boyfriend at the time, Daniel, had planned an intimate evening for us, just the two of us, at his apartment. We weren't the type for extravagant gestures, so it was exactly what I wanted, a quiet, peaceful evening. It had been a while since we'd spent time alone, just the two of us, without the distractions of work or other commitments. I was looking forward to it. Daniel lived in a small, old building on the edge of town. It was the kind of building that seemed stuck in time, with creaky wooden floors and thick, ornate doors. The apartment was on the 3rd floor with a small balcony overlooking the street. I loved how cozy it felt, even with its oddities, like the way the windows would sometimes rattle in the wind or the lights that flickered intermittently. That night, Daniel had made dinner, a homemade lasagna with garlic bread and a bottle of red wine. We ate and talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable kind of conversation that comes naturally when you've been together for a while. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice something strange. I'd been to his apartment many times before, but that night there was a subtle change in the atmosphere. The apartment felt colder than usual, even though the heat was on. The room seemed darker, despite the soft glow of the candles we had lit. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but then I felt it. Someone was watching us. I glanced over at Daniel, who was finishing his glass of wine. He didn't seem to notice, and I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired or anxious, I thought. But it didn't stop. The feeling grew stronger, and I began to hear what sounded like faint whispers. I turned my head quickly, but no one was there. I must have looked confused because Daniel asked, "What's wrong?" I don't know. I keep hearing something, I said, trying to shake off the unease. "It's nothing." He gave me a reassuring smile and reached across the table to hold my hand. "You're just tired. It's been a long day." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right, but as we moved to the couch afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was as if the apartment itself was alive and it had something to say. Daniel must have noticed my growing discomfort because he asked if I wanted to call it a night. "We can just relax," he suggested. "We don't have to do anything." I agreed, relieved by the idea of getting some rest. We turned off the lights and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispers seemed to follow me, soft and unintelligible, like voices floating in from the next room. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to ignore it, but it was no use. The air felt thick, oppressive. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and my breath became visible in the cool air. I felt Daniel shift beside me, his arm coming around my shoulders. He must have sensed how tense I was, but even his presence didn't comfort me. I turned to face him, trying to distract myself from the growing unease. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and soft. I don't know," I whispered. "It just feels strange, like there's something here." He looked at me, his face unreadable. "What do you mean? You're just tired. It's nothing." But I wasn't tired. I was wide awake, and the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, was only growing stronger. "I know this sounds crazy," I said, my voice trembling, "but I think there's something in this apartment." Daniel seemed to hesitate, then took a deep breath. "There's nothing here. I've lived here for months, and I've never felt anything strange. Maybe it's just the dark, or the wine." I didn't argue with him, but deep down I felt something else. I could feel the presence, something ancient and heavy, something that had been here long before we arrived. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't stand it any longer. I got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains. The street below was empty, and the dim streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I closed the curtains again and turned to go back to bed, but as I did, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room. I froze. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then the figure moved. It wasn't clear, more like a shadow than a person, but it was definitely there. I gasped and stumbled backward, my heart racing. I turned to look at Daniel, who was still asleep in bed, unaware of what I had just seen. "Daniel," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. He groggily opened his eyes. "What is it?" "There's someone in here," I said, my voice trembling. He sat up quickly, eyes darting around the room. "What are you talking about?" I pointed toward the corner, but the figure was gone. The room was still, the only sound our breathing. Daniel looked confused. "You're seeing things," he said softly. "There's nothing there." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had clearly seen something that wasn't right. But as I looked at Daniel, I realized he wasn't convinced. He couldn't see it, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. "I'm going to check the apartment," I said, my voice shaking, "just to make sure." Daniel gave me a concerned look, but didn't argue. I got up and moved toward the door. The apartment was silent, too silent. I checked each room one by one, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive stillness that seemed to fill every corner. As I walked back toward the living room, I heard a soft creaking noise, like something shifting. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, just the darkness. I walked back to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. Daniel had turned over, his back to me. I climbed into bed, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But sleep wouldn't come. The whispers had started again, just barely audible, just like someone was speaking through the walls. I could feel the temperature in the room drop further, and my breath became visible once more. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, the sunlight was just beginning to creep through the curtains. The room was warmer now, and the oppressive feeling had lifted somewhat. But I couldn't shake the memory of the figure or the whispers that had followed me all night. I left that morning, telling Daniel I needed some space. He seemed confused, but I couldn't explain it to him, not in a way that would make sense. Something had happened that night, something I couldn't understand. I never went back to his apartment after that, and Daniel and I, we didn't last much longer after that night. The relationship slowly faded, just as the memories of that evening have. But every year, when Valentine's Day rolls around, I can't help but remember the apartment, the strange coldness, the whispers, the shadow in the corner. And I wonder if it wasn't just my imagination, what else might have been in that apartment with us that night? Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the winter of 2013, and I was in my first serious relationship. His name was Matt, and we had been dating for about 6 months. Our relationship had been perfect in so many ways, full of adventure, laughter, and late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. We shared a cozy little apartment in a quiet neighborhood, just the two of us, and I couldn't imagine a life without him. As Valentine's Day approached, I was excited about our first real celebration together. Matt and I weren't big on over-the-top gifts or fancy dinners, but I knew he had something special planned for the day. I'd been busy with work, so the anticipation of a romantic evening was the only thing keeping me going through the hectic days. The evening of February 14th finally arrived. I got home from work to find the apartment lit with candles, soft music playing in the background. Matt was standing in the living room, smiling that goofy grin I loved, holding a single red rose in his hand. "Happy Valentine's Day, babe," he said, handing me the rose. I took it from him and felt a warm glow spread through me. We had plans for a quiet dinner at home, his favorite pasta dish and some wine, but there was an unusual air about the night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Thank you. This is perfect," I said, smelling the rose. But as I held it close to my nose, I felt a strange chill run through my body. The air in the room had shifted, and it felt colder than it should have been for a February night. "You okay?" Matt asked, noticing my change in demeanor. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, shaking it off. "I think I'm just a little tired." We spent the evening cooking together, laughing as we made our meal. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the present, something felt off. I couldn't explain it. The apartment was so familiar, yet tonight it felt different, almost like it didn't belong to us, like there was something or someone else in the room with us. Later, after we'd eaten and cleaned up, Matt suggested we relax on the couch and watch a movie. We picked out something lighthearted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the air around us was growing thicker, colder. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the way the silence hung in the room, like it was holding its breath. About an hour into the movie, the power went out. The room fell into complete darkness. "Great," Matt said, standing up to check the fuse box. "I'll go see if it's just a tripped breaker." "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He left the room, and I was alone in the dark. I could hear the faint hum of the wind outside as it rattled the windows. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, feeling a sudden shiver crawl up my spine. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but it was dead. I sat there in the silence, waiting for Matt to return. But after a few minutes, I began to hear something. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps on the wooden floor. At first thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, closer. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to determine where the footsteps were coming from. I stood up slowly, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room door. I called out, "Matt?" There was no response, just the sound of something shifting behind the door. I felt my pulse quicken. I could see the faint outline of the door and the dim light from the candles, but the shadows around it seemed to move unnaturally, like they were reaching toward me. I stepped forward cautiously, reaching for the door handle. As my fingers brushed against it, the door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but empty space. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it. There was no one there, no sign of any intruder. The footsteps had stopped, and yet the feeling of being watched persisted, like something or someone was lurking just out of sight. The power came back on moments later, and the lights flickered to life. I breathed a sigh of relief, trying to calm my nerves. Matt returned from the hallway, his expression confused. "Hey," I checked the fuse box. It wasn't a trip breaker. It's like the whole building went out for a minute. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "It's fine. Just weird." Matt looked at me closely, noticing my pale face. "What's wrong? You look freaked out." "I don't know," I admitted. "I just felt something, like we weren't alone." He frowned but didn't say anything, seemingly brushing it off. We sat back down on the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, after we'd tried to sleep, I woke up suddenly to a strange noise. It was faint, like a low murmur or whisper coming from somewhere in the apartment. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, more distinct this time. It sounded like someone was speaking, but the words were too soft to make out. I turned to Matt, shaking him gently. "Matt, are you awake?" He stirred but didn't respond. I shook him harder, now growing more frantic. "Matt!" He groggily opened his eyes, his face confused. "What's going on?" "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Matt frowned, listening intently. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't hear anything." I sat up, my mind racing. The voice was still there, low and insistent, but now it felt closer, like it was coming from the other side of the room. "Maybe it's just the wind," Matt said, rubbing his eyes. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I was too unsettled, too afraid. I got up, walking toward the living room once again, but the apartment was still and silent now. The faint whispers had stopped. I stood there for a long time, looking around the empty room. Something wasn't right. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive presence that I couldn't shake. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, and my heart pounded in my chest. Suddenly, I felt it, a cold hand brushing against my arm. I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The room was empty, the lights flickering once again as the shadows seemed to stretch longer. I didn't wait for Matt to wake up. I grabbed my things and ran out of the apartment, down the stairs and into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and terrified. I didn't go back to that apartment. Matt tried to reach me the next day, but I couldn't bring myself to answer his calls. The events of that night had shaken me to my core. It wasn't just the footsteps or the whispers, it was the sense that something dark had followed us home, something that had been waiting for us. It's been years now, but I've never been able to forget that night. Sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear those whispers again, and I can feel the chill in the air. I wonder if it was something in that building, something that never left, or if it was something else entirely, something darker, something that came to us on Valentine's Day. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was February 14th, 2018. Valentine's Day. A day meant for love, for romance, for happy memories. But for me, that day would become a reminder of something far darker. I had been dating Ellie for 6 months. She was perfect for me, kind, intelligent, and always up for adventure. We'd met in college, and although we'd come from different backgrounds, we hit it off immediately. She had an easy way about her, a way that made everything seem effortless, including love. We had planned a quiet weekend getaway in a small cabin upstate for Valentine's Day. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, just the two of us, surrounded by nature. The cabin was secluded, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The idea of being away from everything, just us and the forest, felt perfect. I imagined long walks in the snow, cozy fireside chats, and a weekend full of warmth and intimacy. We arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The drive had been long, and the landscape, covered in snow, was beautiful in its own way, like a scene from a winter postcard. The cabin itself was older than I had expected, but still charming. Its stone foundation, wooden beams, and creaky floors gave it character, a sort of rustic elegance. As we unpacked our things, I noticed something odd. The cabin seemed unnaturally cold, despite the heat being on. But Ellie, ever the optimist, brushed it off, saying it was just the old wood and the cold mountain air. We spent the evening making dinner together, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. It felt like the perfect night. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice something unsettling. It wasn't overt, but there was a sense of tension, a presence that seemed to hang in the air. At first, I thought it was just the strange, unfamiliar surroundings, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, it was as if the walls themselves were closing in. Ellie didn't seem to notice anything. She was busy lighting candles and setting the table, but every now and then I would catch her glancing toward the hallway, as if she were hearing something. I asked her about it, but she just smiled and shook her head, insisting it was nothing. After dinner, we settled on the couch, wrapped in blankets, watching a romantic comedy. I tried to enjoy the movie, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease inside me. The house was so quiet, too quiet. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Outside, the wind was picking up, its eerie howls muffled by the thick walls of the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, but I felt chilled to the bone. I tried to shake off the feeling. It's just the atmosphere, I told myself. The isolation, the wind, it's all in your head. But then it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden darkness felt suffocating, and I froze in my seat. I could hear Ellie's voice, calm but laced with concern, asking if I'd check the fuse box. "I'll go check," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way through the pitch-black cabin. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the only sound was the wind outside and the faint crackling of the fireplace. I fumbled with the flashlight I'd grabbed from my bag, trying to illuminate the narrow hallway. The beam of light flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something move in the darkness, just at the edge of the light. A figure, perhaps. But when I turned the beam toward it, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. I found the fuse box in the back of the cabin, and as I flipped the switch, the lights returned to life. I let out a relieved sigh and returned to the living room, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had taken hold of me. "Everything's fine," I said, sitting back down next to Ellie. She smiled at me, but I noticed that her expression was more serious than before. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was thinking about something. We resumed watching the movie, but it was clear neither of us was really paying attention anymore. The wind outside had grown louder, and the cabin seemed to groan and shift with every gust. It felt as if the house were alive, breathing, watching. Around 1 a.m., we decided to head to bed. Ellie and I had shared a room upstairs, the only bedroom in the cabin. The bed was large with thick, soft blankets, and for a moment I felt comforted by its warmth. But the feeling didn't last long. As I lay there, with Ellie already asleep beside me, I began to hear it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, as if someone were speaking right outside the door. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was the wind again, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, guttural voice calling my name. "Jack." My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward Ellie, who was still asleep, completely unaware of the strange voice. I got out of bed slowly, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the temperature had dropped even further. I walked cautiously to the door, my hand on the doorknob. The whispering continued, though now it sounded like it was coming from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. The hallway outside was dark, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something, an oppressive weight in the air. A presence. It felt as though I wasn't alone. I called out, my voice shaking, "Ellie? Is that you?" But there was no answer, only the whispering. I stepped into the hallway, the beam of my flashlight barely illuminating the walls. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I took a few steps toward the stairs, my pulse racing in my chest. The whispering grew louder, and the voice, distorted, almost unrecognizable, spoke again. "Jack, come down." I froze. That voice, it wasn't Ellie's, and it wasn't coming from anywhere in the house I could see. The whisper seemed to echo from the very walls, from the floorboards beneath my feet. My hands trembled as I turned the flashlight toward the staircase. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of the stairs. It was tall, shadowy, and indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like the figure was not quite part of this world. It stood motionless, watching me with an unnatural stillness. I couldn't breathe, my throat tightened, and my heart pounded in my ears. For a moment I was frozen, unable to move or speak, but then the figure began to glide toward me, its form growing more defined with each step. "Jack, come down." The voice now sounded directly in my ear, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around in terror, but there was nothing there. I turned back toward the stairs, and the figure was gone. Just like that, it had vanished. I ran back to the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. Ellie stirred in the bed, mumbling something incoherent, but I couldn't bring myself to wake her. I was paralyzed by fear. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl and the whispers that still echoed through the cabin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure, its eyes staring into mine. The next morning, Ellie was concerned when she saw how pale and shaken I was. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? We packed up and left the cabin early, the sunlight barely touching the forest as we drove away. I couldn't look back. That was the last time I spent a Valentine's Day with Ellie. The whispers, the figure, the strange coldness, it all became a part of me, a memory that haunts me still. I don't know what it was that night, what I encountered in that cabin, but I know this. That voice, the shadow, it was something not of this world, and I will never forget the fear I felt that night on Valentine's Day. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was February 14th, 2017, Valentine's Day, a day that many associate with love, romance, and celebration, but for me, it was the day my life changed forever. That day would be the one I would always look back on with a chill, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. I had been dating Laura for almost a year. She was everything I'd been looking for, funny, kind, and just the right amount of quirky. We were planning to spend a quiet evening together, just the two of us. I had made a reservation at a small bed and breakfast in the countryside, hoping for a peaceful romantic weekend away. The place was tucked away in the hills, surrounded by dense woods, a perfect escape from the city. We arrived around 5 p.m., just as the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The B&B was charming, with ivy crawling up the brick walls and a small porch with rocking chairs. It had an old-world charm with its creaky wooden floors and antique furniture. We were greeted by a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She seemed friendly enough, but had a distant quality, as though her mind was somewhere else. "The room is ready for you," she said, her voice soft but matter of fact. "You'll be on the second floor. Dinner is at 7, so please don't be late." We nodded, thanked her, and took our bags up the narrow staircase. The room was cozy, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, antique dressers, and a small window that overlooked the woods. There was a strange, musty smell in the air, but nothing that immediately alarmed me. I brushed it off, assuming it was just the old building. After unpacking, we decided to take a walk around the property before dinner. The wind was cold, and the air smelled of pine and earth. We strolled down a path that led into the woods, chatting about life, our plans for the future, and the small things that brought us joy. As we walked deeper into the trees, I began to notice that the woods felt eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an uncomfortable silence that felt out of place. "Do you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice suddenly tense. I paused, straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft sound like whispering. It was almost imperceptible, carried on the wind, but there was no one else around. "I don't hear anything," I replied, trying to brush it off. But Laura's expression had changed. "It's like someone is talking, but I can't make out the words." I laughed nervously. "You're probably just hearing things. It's probably the wind." But the more we walked, the stronger the sense of unease grew. It felt like the air was pressing in on us, like we weren't alone. Every so often, I would glance behind us, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. Just the stillness, thick and heavy. We turned back and made our way to the B&B. As we approached the house, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something about the house felt wrong. The warmth of the building did little to ease the strange sensation that had settled in my chest. We walked inside, and the strange woman greeted us again. "Dinner will be served in half an hour," she said, her eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. It was unsettling. The dining room was warmly lit, with a long wooden table covered in a red tablecloth and candles flickering softly. As we sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The food was delicious, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though the house itself was watching us. I tried to focus on the conversation, but every time I glanced around the room, I couldn't help but feel like I was being observed. The woman had disappeared after dinner, and we were left alone in the room. The fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. We should go to bed early, Laura suggested, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. I'm feeling kind of strange. I agreed, though I couldn't explain why I felt the same. There was something about the house, about the night, that made me feel on edge. We retired to our room, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we walked. As we lay in bed, I tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The night was silent, save for the occasional wind outside. But then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard something, a soft, indistinct whisper. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, and Laura was fast asleep beside me. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 2:15 a.m. The whispering was coming from somewhere downstairs, barely audible but unmistakable. It sounded like someone was talking in hushed tones, but the words were distorted, as if being spoken in a language I didn't understand. I slowly got out of bed and walked to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I cracked the door open just a sliver, peering down the narrow hallway. Everything was still except for the faint whispering coming from downstairs. It was so faint, I almost thought I was imagining it. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, breathy voice. Close. Too close. Help me. The words were clear this time. I jerked the door open and stepped into the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. I reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, the whispering stopped. Complete silence. My heart raced, and I felt a shiver run through me. I turned back to Laura, who was still asleep, unaware of the strange events unfolding around us. I walked down the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, and into the living room. It was empty, and the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Then I saw it, a figure standing by the window. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face obscured by the darkness. She was staring out into the woods, unmoving. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The woman didn't acknowledge me, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, and I reached for the light. The moment I touched the switch, the woman vanished. I was left standing alone in the dark room, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back upstairs, my mind reeling. I tried to wake Laura, but she was still sound asleep. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in that house, unable to escape the oppressive feeling of being watched. I lay back down, pulling the covers over my head, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept seeing the woman's face, her pale features, her vacant eyes. Morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. We packed up and left the B&B early, the sunlight breaking through the trees as we made our way back to the car. I didn't speak much to Laura, my mind still racing with what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it or if I even wanted to. I had no answers. But I couldn't forget the woman in the window, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. We never returned to that place, and every Valentine's Day since, I can't help but remember the whispering, the figure by the window, and the feeling that on that night, something truly dark had awakened. Story the end. I don't know if I truly believe in ghosts, but that night, Valentine's Day, changed everything. I still feel it sometimes, like the air is just a little colder, a little heavier, and no matter where I go, there's always something lurking behind my thoughts. I know I can't forget. I don't want to. I have to tell someone, and you're the only one who can understand. It started like any other Valentine's Day. I was young, newly in love, and completely enthralled by the thought of a quiet evening with my girlfriend, Eliza. We were both students, broke, but eager to make the most of it. The university was a small town, nestled between a stretch of woods and the deep blue of the lake. It was picturesque, especially when the snow would fall like powdery flakes, turning the landscape into something out of a dream. We decided to take a little getaway to a cabin in the woods. The idea was to escape for the weekend and just be with each other. No distractions, no pressure, just us. Eliza had heard about it from a friend who'd rented the cabin before, and despite her warnings that it was a little off the beaten path, we both thought it would be perfect. The cabin was only about an hour outside the town, and the thought of being surrounded by snow and trees felt so romantic. The drive up was magical. We passed through thick pine trees and rolling hills, the road winding beneath the weight of the snow. By the time we arrived, dusk was falling. The snow had started to pile up on the ground, making everything look like a winter wonderland. The cabin was small but charming, built in the classic log cabin style, with a wood-burning stove and huge windows that looked out onto the trees. The air smelled fresh, like pine and cold earth. The first night was perfect. We made dinner together, played cards, and shared a bottle of wine. The warmth from the stove kept the chill at bay. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. We went to bed early, the kind of night where you fall asleep wrapped in each other's arms. But around 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't from any noise. It was the feeling, the kind of feeling where you're suddenly aware of something being off, something not quite right. My eyes flickered open, and I saw Eliza was still sleeping soundly beside me. I shifted a little, trying to ignore the uncomfortable tension that seemed to fill the room. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The floorboards outside creaked softly. My heart began to beat faster. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, or if there really was someone moving around the cabin in the middle of the night. I crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. I didn't want to wake Eliza, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The cabin was too quiet. The wind outside had picked up, but even that didn't sound right. It was as if the wind was muffled by something inside the cabin itself. I slowly opened the door to the hallway. The cabin was dark, save for the glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. The only light came from the soft flickering of the dying embers in the stove. I peered down the hallway, but nothing moved. The footsteps had stopped. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. I called out softly, "Hello?" My voice was small in the emptiness, almost swallowed by the weight of the silence. No answer. I walked down the hall, past the living room, and toward the kitchen. There was a feeling of heaviness in the air, like the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on me. The room was empty, just as I'd left it earlier in the evening. I turned to head back down the hall, my heart racing. That's when I saw it, a shadow just outside the window. It was subtle at first, barely there, just a shift in the darkness that made my blood run cold. I took a cautious step toward the window, feeling as if my every move was being watched. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see nothing. But instead, I saw a figure standing in the snow outside the cabin. It wasn't clear at first. The figure was cloaked in the dark, just a shape against the swirling snow. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. It was a woman. She stood there in a long, flowing white dress, her hair blowing around her face. Her back was turned to me, and she seemed to be staring into the woods. I froze. My hands trembled as I clutched the curtain. The woman didn't move. I couldn't breathe. I blinked, my heart thudding in my chest. The snow around her was untouched, perfectly still. Yet there she was, standing in the night, as if waiting. I quickly pulled the curtain shut, my mind racing. I wanted to wake Eliza, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I was paralyzed with fear. What if it wasn't real? What if I was imagining it? I decided I had to check again. I cautiously approached the window once more, peeking through the edges of the curtain, but the woman was gone. The snow was undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. There was no explanation. I hurried back to the bedroom, climbing into bed beside Eliza. I wrapped myself around her, trying to feel her warmth, to remind myself that I wasn't alone. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't dare sleep, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The next morning, I told Eliza about the woman. She looked at me with concern, but there was no disbelief in her eyes. She didn't dismiss it outright, but we didn't talk about it much. Instead, we tried to push it from our minds, chalking it up to stress or fatigue. We spent the day outside, walking through the woods, hoping the fresh air would help us forget. But things didn't get better. The strange occurrences continued. That night, as we sat in front of the fire, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. Just a blur, a fleeting figure near the door. I couldn't focus on it long enough to get a clear image, but I knew it was there. The woman never appeared again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed that night. The air was always just a little too cold, the shadows a little too dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of her presence, the woman from the window. It's as if she's never left. We left the cabin early the next morning, our bags packed hastily. We didn't talk much on the drive home. I don't know if Eliza had seen anything or if she just didn't want to admit what had happened, but we never spoke of it again. Every Valentine's Day since then, the memory creeps up on me. I hear the wind in the trees, and I feel the cold that isn't there, the weight of unseen eyes following me. I don't know what it was that night or who the woman was, but I know one thing. She's still out there somewhere, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was February 14th, 2018, a crisp winter evening in a small town nestled between rolling hills and dark forests. I had always loved Valentine's Day, a day to celebrate love and happiness, but that year it was different. It marked a turning point in my life, one I'd never fully be able to explain. I was dating Sarah at the time, a kind-hearted woman I met through work. We weren't overly romantic, but Valentine's Day felt like a perfect excuse to escape our busy lives. We decided on a weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast up in the mountains. The place was remote, tucked away in the woods, a beautiful old building surrounded by trees and a small lake that froze over in winter. The kind of place where you could forget about the world and just be together. The day we arrived, the sky was a soft gray, and snow was beginning to fall in delicate sheets. The B&B had a warm, inviting charm with its brick exterior and quaint front porch, rocking chairs swaying gently in the breeze. It was a place that looked like it had been around for a century, untouched by time. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Carter, greeted us with a warm smile. Her wrinkled face had a calm, almost serene expression. She handed us a set of keys and informed us dinner would be served at 7 p.m., but that we could enjoy the property before then. I felt a slight unease when I met her gaze. Her eyes were a little too intense, almost as though she could see right through me, but I quickly pushed the feeling aside. It was a silly notion. After settling into our room, which had a view of the frozen lake, we decided to take a walk through the woods. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like hands grasping for something lost. The snow beneath our boots crunched with every step, and the world felt quieter than usual. Sarah seemed content, her smile radiating the kind of warmth that made me feel at peace. As we ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed a strange quietness. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, the rustling of small animals, were absent. It wasn't entirely silent, though. There was a hum in the air, almost as though something was lurking, but it was so faint I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Sarah noticed it too. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. I looked at her, confused. "Feel what?" "The air. It feels different." I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. "It's just the cold," I said. "Nothing to worry about." But she didn't look convinced. Her eyes kept scanning the trees, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. After a few more minutes of walking, we returned to the B&B for dinner. As we sat at the table, the fire crackling in the hearth, I tried to brush off the odd feeling from our walk. Mrs. Carter served us a delicious meal, but there was something unsettling about her. The way she hovered by the table, watching us with an almost unnatural intensity. Every time I caught her eye, there was a knowing smile on her face, as though she was aware of something we weren't. That night, we retired to our room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. We snuggled under the thick covers, the warmth from the bed doing little to ease the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned over, my back facing Sarah, hoping sleep would come soon and quiet my racing thoughts. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard something. A soft whisper. It was barely audible, like someone was talking in the other room. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were too clear, too distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling my name. I stiffened. "Sarah," I whispered, but she didn't answer. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and that's when I realized she was already awake, her body tense. "I heard it too," she said, her voice shaky. "What do you think it was?" "I don't know, but it sounded like someone calling for help." The air in the room felt thicker now, colder, and I pulled the covers tighter around me. But the whispering continued, softer now, but still present. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. "It's probably just the house settling," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Sarah and I lay there in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was morning. The sun was streaming through the window, and everything felt normal again. But as we got dressed and prepared for the day, I noticed something strange. The bed was undisturbed, but there was a faint trail of snow that led from the window to the door, like someone had walked through it during the night. I went over to investigate, but the window was shut tight. There was no way snow could have blown in from the outside. I didn't mention it to Sarah. I didn't want to worry her, but my mind was spinning. What had happened during the night? Had I imagined the whispers? We spent the day outside, walking around the property, trying to shake off the strange atmosphere that had settled over us. It helped for a while until we returned to the cabin that evening. Mrs. Carter wasn't there when we arrived, but there was a note on the door. It read, "Dinner will be served in the dining room at 7. Please make yourselves at home." As we made our way inside, I noticed something odd. The atmosphere felt heavier, more oppressive. The air was cold, but the fire in the hearth should have been warming the room. When we reached the dining room, Mrs. Carter wasn't there either. The table was set, candles lit, but there was no sign of her. We took a seat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple voices, overlapping, all calling out. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I felt it deep in my chest. It was like they were reaching out from the other side, trying to communicate something important. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Sarah looked around, her face pale. "It's coming from upstairs." I stood up, my heart racing. "We need to check it out." We climbed the stairs cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the quiet. As we reached the top, the whispering grew louder until it was deafening. We followed the sound down the hallway, stopping in front of a door at the far end. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was empty, except for Mrs. Carter. She was standing in the corner, facing the wall, her back to us. But that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the way she was standing, rigid, unnatural. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and her hands were stretched out in front of her as if she were reaching for something we couldn't see. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on us. And then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "Leave before it's too late. She's coming for you." I didn't need to hear anything else. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispering stopped immediately, but I could feel it lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. We left the cabin in a rush, not looking back. As we drove away, the snow falling behind us, I looked at Sarah and she looked at me. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew we weren't going back there. Ever. We never spoke of it again, but every year on Valentine's Day, I feel the chill in the air and I can still hear the whispering. I don't know who or what Mrs. Carter was, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever she was, it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was February 14th, a chilly winter night in my small hometown. I had never really liked Valentine's Day. It was always more about the pressure of love and expectations rather than anything real or special. Still, that year felt different. I was newly single, having broken up with my boyfriend just a couple of weeks earlier. There was a hollow feeling in my chest, but I tried to brush it off. My plan was to spend the evening at home, binge watching rom-coms, eating pizza, and maybe indulging in some wine. The night was quiet when I got home. I'd just moved into an old house on the edge of town, one that had seen better days. It was large, with creaky floors and the smell of must and old wood. It wasn't exactly a house I would have chosen if I had more time to think about it, but it was all I could afford after the breakup. There was something eerie about it, but I figured it was just my overactive imagination. After all, an old house in a small town can't possibly be haunted, right? That evening, the house seemed particularly cold. I tried to dismiss the sensation as a draft, but it lingered, the chill wrapping around me as I settled into the couch. I started my movie marathon, but something about the house felt different that night. The old clock in the hallway struck midnight, the sound of the chimes echoing through the silence. The flickering of the candlelight in the living room made the shadows seem deeper, more alive than they should have been. I thought I heard faint sounds of footsteps upstairs, but when I checked, there was no one there. I laughed at myself, shaking my head. I'm just being paranoid. I returned to the couch, and as the night went on, I started to doze off. It was then that I heard it, a soft, gentle knock at the door. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, but when the knock came again, a little louder, I was wide awake. My first instinct was to check who it was. I grabbed my phone, glancing at the time, 12:30 a.m. It seemed strange for anyone to be out at that hour, especially on Valentine's Day. Still, I cautiously went to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. I felt a rush of cold air again, this time sharper, as if the house itself had shifted. I stepped back, confused, but then the knock came again, more urgent this time. The sound was so clear, so distinct, it was impossible to ignore. I opened the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. There was nothing, just the empty, snow-covered front steps. I shut the door, the strange feeling in my gut growing. I couldn't explain it, but I had a sense that something was wrong. Something was watching me, or waiting for me. The air in the house felt thick, pressing in on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I checked the locks on the door, then hurried back to the couch, curling up beneath a blanket. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. The floor creaked. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The sound had come from upstairs. I had lived in the house for over a month, and the noises weren't anything new. But tonight, they felt different, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself I was just imagining things, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the upstairs hallway. It wasn't just the house settling. It was too distinct, too rhythmic. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breath. "You're just freaking out over nothing." I debated whether to go upstairs to check it out, but the thought of confronting whatever was making the sound made my stomach churn. My mind raced through possible explanations. Was it the house settling, the wind, a stray animal? But none of those things seemed to make sense. Not with how clear the footsteps had been. The knocking returned. I rushed to the door again, heart pounding in my chest. But again, there was no one there. Just the cold, empty darkness of the night. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, the faint sound of wind whistling through the trees outside. I didn't know what to do. Something was in the house. I could feel it. It wasn't just the weird noises or the knocking. It was the air itself, the heaviness, the cold that didn't belong. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more it seemed to press in around me. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend, Sarah. My hands were shaking. She picked up almost immediately. "Hello?" "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening, but there's something in this house. It feels wrong. There were knocks on the door, and there's something upstairs. Footsteps." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure you're okay?" "It's just a house. You're probably just overthinking it, especially after everything." "I'm not imagining this," I snapped, the frustration bubbling over. "I swear I can hear someone walking around upstairs, and the knocking, it's like someone wants to get in." Okay, she said softly. "You're right. I'm sorry. Do you want me to come over?" I hesitated. I knew she would if I asked, but the idea of being alone in that house with someone else made me feel like I could breathe again. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just being dramatic. I'm probably just tired. I'll be fine. Just lock up, stay away from the door, and text me if you feel unsafe, okay?" "Yeah," I said, feeling a little more reassured. "Thanks." We hung up, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I locked every door in the house, making sure the windows were secure. Then I sat down on the couch again, pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and measured, and I could hear the faint rustle of something or someone moving in the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across the corner of the room, flickering just outside my vision. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just the light or the way the shadows were playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again, this time more clearly, a figure standing just at the edge of the hallway. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face hidden in the darkness. She seemed to be watching me, unmoving, as though waiting for something. I gasped, but the figure was gone as quickly as it appeared. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Was I imagining things? Was this grief from my breakup playing with my mind? Or was it something real? I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and ran out into the night. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the whisper of the wind through the trees. I went straight to Sarah's house, and when I told her everything, she just nodded, not sure what to say. The next day, I went back to my house with Sarah, determined to face whatever was in there. But everything was calm. Too calm. There were no strange noises, no knocks on the door. It was as if the house had gone back to its normal, quiet self. I never spent another Valentine's Day alone in that house. I moved out a month later, and I never went back. But I'll never forget the feeling of that night. The footsteps, the knocking, and the figure standing in the hallway. Some things are best left unexplained. Story the end.